Now, former Trump Homeland Security official Miles Taylor, he's the author of Blowback, a warning to save democracy from Trump's revenge. He's also the subject of a DOJ investigation recently ordered by President Trump. I'm also joined by national security lawyer Dan Meyer. Glad to have both of you here. Let me begin with you on this, Miles, because Bolton is, of course, a staunch critic of the president, as we have all heard. We should also note the FBI director, Kash Patel, included him on a list of more than 50 officials, 50, that he says are, quote, members of the deep state. And in fact, you're also on Patel's list. Do you believe the search today was politically motivated?
Absolutely. No question. Not only do I think it was politically motivated, Laura, I do think this is one of the most egregious things we've seen yet in the second Trump administration. And that sounds maybe a little hyperbolic. A lot of things have happened that are pretty shocking during this administration. But this was sort of the visual culmination of the thing that many people have been warning about for months and for years, is that Donald Trump would use the investigative organs of government to go after his enemies. And make no mistake, this is exactly that. And in fact, I tallied up tonight, there are, at least by my count, 5 people who are being investigated by parts of the administration. Let me list them off to you. John Bolton, John Brennan, James Comey, Miles Taylor, Alex Vindman. Now, what do those 5 people have in common? Yes, they all wrote books about Donald Trump, but they all wrote critical books about Donald Trump. What I couldn't think of, Laura, is whether there's anyone who wrote a flattering book about Donald Trump that's being investigated for the release of classified information like John Bolton. Yet the vice president today wanted us to believe that this had nothing to do with revenge. That's an awful big coincidence that people who wrote critical books are being conflated as people who potentially engaged in dissemination unlawfully of classified information.
Dan, let me bring you in here, because this wasn't as if it was directly ordered from the president. There was a magistrate judge who signed off on a warrant to have this actually executed. But what's the criteria for people to understand that would have to go into play to be able to do this sort of warrant, but also what they're looking for potentially?
Well, you have to remember that just because a warrant's been issued doesn't mean there's smoke, doesn't mean there's fire. John Bolton is guilty of nothing at this point in time. All that's happening is there's a collection of evidence by federal investigators. They have to have probable cause and reasonable belief, not by the judge, but by somebody who's in a position to understand what the alleged classified information is, where it's located, and how it is attached to John Bolton. That information is a pretty low standard. So searches go on all the time, more so electronically than physical. They're dramatic. He's a celebrity, and so it garners a lot of attention. But federal employees in Washington, D.C. have been dealing with this type of investigation for decades. And so a judge has to be convinced, and a judge was convinced. So there was some protection for Ambassador Bolton in that there had to be some information coming forward. That information could turn out to be wrong. It has happened. I have supervised investigations where there were actually falsified affidavits that went to judges. It happens. Yeah. So we shouldn't jump to conclusions that he is guilty somehow of some retention of classified information.
I am curious, because this was actually the investigation of Bolton actually happened during the first Trump administration. The Biden administration and the DOJ served under his administration, they did not pursue it. It's now been brought up again. Is that unusual?
No, it actually isn't unusual, and I wouldn't assume that that was political. What probably happened was somebody in the Justice Department gathered up all the evidence, looked at it, and decided that if they took that to an assistant U.S. attorney, the assistant U.S. attorney would probably not go forward. There are often passionate fights between U.S. attorneys about who should take a case, who should not take a case. Sometimes investigators will think that their evidence is just beautiful, and an attorney will look and say, no, I can't convince a judge or a jury on that.
Miles, you mentioned the Vice President, J.D. Vance. He was asked about the search earlier today. Here's what he said.
Is Ambassador Bolton being targeted because he's a critic of President Trump?
No, not at all. And in fact, if we were trying to do that, we would just throw out prosecutions willy-nilly like the Biden administration DOJ did. If they ultimately bring a case, it will be because they determine that he has broken the law. We're going to be careful about that. We're going to be deliberate about that because we don't think that we should throw people, even if they disagree with us politically, maybe especially if they disagree with us politically. You shouldn't throw people willy-nilly in prison. You should let the law drive these determinations, and that's what we're doing.
To that, Miles, do you believe it? Do you think that's the prudent course?
Well, look, in my view, the Vice President of the United States is a smart man, but unfortunately he thinks that we are not smart in listening to that. This would be an extraordinary coincidence that so many people who have been critical of Donald Trump for so many years consistently are finding themselves on the receiving end of retribution from the executive branch. Come on. I mean, we're not stupid about that. I mean, I think, it is very obvious that there are political motivations here. And as Dan was noting, we don't know what was taken to a judge to get signed off. But look, I've had a lot of these conversations, as you'd expect, the last few months. There's extraordinary worry across the legal community that there are agents and intelligence officers across the U.S. government that maybe have a favorable view of the president, that might be willing to swear on affidavits, things that don't really hold up at the end of the day in court, to be able to help go investigate his enemies. That's a scary thing to see happening in the United States. But there's another part of the vice president's comments that are worrying, Laura, is he said that this was the start of an investigation into Ambassador Bolton. Typically, in a case like this, especially a case involving the Espionage Act, the raid of his home and his offices would be one of the last major investigative steps. So this, to me, smacked of a fishing expedition.
Well, we shall see whether this is the beginning, the middle, or the end. Something tells me it's certainly not the end. Miles Taylor, Dan Meyer, will continue to pick your brain. Thank you so much.